May 13, 1945. 5 days after Germany's unconditional surrender. The war was over. But General Major Friedrich von Schell was still at attention in front of the enemy who'd beaten him. His hand trembled as he held his officer's cap. Not from fear. Von Schell had survived both world wars, and had been decorated by the Kaiser himself in 1917. The trembling came from something worse than fear. Irrelevance. See, here's what nobody tells you about military surrender. The shooting stops, but something harder begins. For professional soldiers, especially Prussian officers whose families had served for 200 years, their entire identity was built on a single foundation, the oath. Ich schwöre bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid. I swear before God this sacred oath. When that oath becomes void, when the nation you swore to serve no longer exists, you're not just a defeated soldier. You're a man without purpose, standing in the ruins of everything that defined you. And General George S. Patton, the man who just smashed through Germany faster than any army in history, needed something from this defeated officer that felt worse than death. He needed cooperation. General Major, Patton said, leaning against a desk in the commandeered Bavarian town hall, I'm putting you in charge of administering this district. Food distribution, infrastructure repair, civilian order. You know this region. You speak the language. My men are soldiers, not bureaucrats. The room went silent. 4 American officers watched, hands near their sidearms. Outside, German civilians cleared rubble from streets Patton's Third Army had rolled through just days before. Von Schell's jaw tightened. The dueling scar on his left cheek, a mark of honor from his university days, seemed to deepen. I understand what you ask of me, General Patton. His English was formal, precise, the accent of the old aristocracy. And I must inform you that I cannot comply. One of the American lieutenants shifted nervously. Everyone knew Patton's reputation. Old blood and guts. The general who'd slapped a soldier for cowardice. The man who drove his tanks so hard that Eisenhower had to order him to slow down. Von Schell continued, each word deliberate. A Prussian officer does not serve the forces that conquered his nation. To do so would violate every principle I have lived by for 35 years. You will have to kill me first. It wasn't bravado. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who'd already made peace with death. And that's when something remarkable happened, something that revealed a leadership principle that's been studied in military academies for 80 years. Because Patton didn't get angry. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not a mocking smile. A smile of recognition. The look of a man who'd just seen exactly what his opponent's weakness was. And it wasn't cowardice. It was pride. What Patton did next shocked everyone in that room. And it proves something fundamental about human psychology that applies to every negotiation, every leadership challenge, every moment when someone has trapped themselves with their own principles. You can't force a proud man to surrender his identity. But you can build him a bridge that lets him redefine it. If you've ever faced someone who's dug in so deep that forcing them to back down would only make things worse, if you've ever needed cooperation from someone whose pride won't let them give it, then what happens next is going to change how you handle conflict forever. But here's the thing. Most people never see this technique because they're too busy doing what everyone expects. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel breaks down historical moments that teach you principles you won't find anywhere else. Principles that actually work when everything conventional fails. Now let's see what Patton understood that everyone else in that room missed. Von Schell's defiance wasn't madness. It wasn't even stubbornness. To understand what happened in that room, you need to understand what it meant to be a Prussian officer. The scar on his left cheek told part of the story. A Schmiss, the mark of a university duel, earned with sabers at Heidelberg in 1910 when von Schell was 22 years old. In the German universities before the wars, young men from military families would face each other with sharpened blades to prove they could stand unflinching before violence. The scars weren't accidents. They were deliberately sought, worn with pride for the rest of your life. Visible proof that you belonged to a warrior caste that valued courage above comfort. But the scar was just the surface. The real mark went deeper. In 1912, Friedrich von Schell stood in a ceremony that hadn't changed in substance since 1653, when Friedrich Wilhelm, the great elector of Brandenburg, Prussia, created something unprecedented in European warfare, a professional officer corps bound not by feudal loyalty to a lord, but by personal oath sworn before God. For 3 centuries, that tradition evolved into something almost religious. Young von Skell, 24 years old, raised his right hand and spoke words that would define the next 35 years of his life. Ich schwor bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid, das ich dem deutschen Kaiser und König von Prussen Wilhelm dem Zweiten, meinem obersten Kriegsherrn, in allen Dingen Treue und Gehorsam leisten. I swear before God this sacred oath that I will render unconditional obedience to the German Emperor and King of Prussia Wilhelm II. It wasn't blind obedience. The Prussian tradition called it Kadavergehorsam, corpse-like obedience, but that phrase misleads modern ears. It didn't mean thoughtless submission. It meant obedience chosen deliberately, maintained through conscious will even unto death, because you had sworn before God and your sworn word was the foundation of your identity as an officer and a man. 2 years later, von Skell was in the trenches of the First World War. He watched the Kaiser's army bleed itself white in places like Verdun and the Somme. He saw friends die in mud, watched the old certainties of European civilization collapse into industrial slaughter. And when Germany sued for peace in 1918 and the Kaiser abdicated, von Skell faced his first existential crisis. The oath had been to the Kaiser. The Kaiser was gone. What now? The answer the officer corps gave itself was profound. The oath transcended the man. You served Germany eternal, not temporary regimes. Kaisers come and go. Republics rise and fall. But Germany, the land, the people, the concept of the nation, endures. And a Prussian officer serves that eternal Germany through whatever political form it temporarily takes. So von Skell served through the chaos of Weimar, through the hyperinflation that destroyed the middle class, through the political violence between communists and Nazis in the streets. He served with reservation when Hitler rose to power in 1933, because the oath didn't require you to love the regime. It required you to serve Germany through the regime. An officer serves Germany, he told his son in 1938, when the boy asked why his father wore the uniform of a government von Skell privately despised, not chancellors. Chancellors come and go. Germany endures. 35 years of service built on that foundation. 35 years of identity formation around a single organizing principle. The oath makes you who you are, and you maintain it regardless of personal cost. Now it was May 1945. Germany didn't endure. The nation was split, occupied by 4 foreign powers. Its government was dissolved. The Third Reich was gone, but so was any recognizable German state to serve. The oath that had given von Skell's entire adult life meaning, from age 24 to 59, had nowhere to attach. And this American general wanted him to use his expertise to help administer the occupation. To German civilians in the street, it might seem reasonable. To the young American officers in the room, it was a simple request. Help us govern your region efficiently, prevent chaos, protect your own people. To von Skell, it was spiritual annihilation. Because if he cooperated with the occupiers, the oath meant nothing. Every friend who died in the trenches, every sacrifice made over 35 years, every time he'd subordinated his personal judgment to duty, all of it reduced to nothing more than following orders, serving whoever held power. The occupiers today, someone else tomorrow. A mercenary with a fancy title and a dueling scar. That's why he'd rather die. Death at least had meaning. Death said, I was a Prussian officer until the end. I kept the oath. I didn't betray it for convenience or survival. Standing there in front of Patton, von Skell wasn't defending a military position. He wasn't being defiant for pride's sake. He was defending the architecture of his entire identity, the structure his psyche had built over 35 years that made him who he was. Without it, he wasn't defeated. He was dissolved. Better to die as someone than live as no one. But Patton understood something von Skell didn't yet see. That tradition can be a strength or a cage, depending on how you interpret it. Patton's problem wasn't one defiant German officer. His problem was Bavaria. The map on the table in front of him told the story in red pencil marks and hastily scribbled numbers. 42 districts. 1.2 million displaced persons flooding into the American occupation zone. Freed slave laborers, concentration camp survivors, refugees fleeing the Soviet advance from the east, German civilians driven from their homes. The infrastructure that kept a modern society functioning had been systematically destroyed. Railways blown. Bridges collapsed. Water systems are contaminated. Electrical grids dead. And food. Jesus Christ, the food situation. Pre-war Bavaria had imported 60% of its food from other regions of Germany. Those supply lines were severed. The harvest of 1944 had been catastrophic. Every able-bodied man either dead, crippled, or still in POW camps. The 1945 planting season was a disaster because there were no draft animals, no fuel for tractors, no functioning distribution system for seed. Patton's logistics officers estimated they had maybe 6 weeks before serious famine conditions set in. To administer this chaos, Patton had approximately 6 American military government officers for every 100,000 German civilians. 6 men to govern 100,000 hostile, traumatized people whose cities were rubble and whose children were starving. His officers were soldiers, not bureaucrats. They didn't speak German. They didn't understand the local systems, the Byzantine web of municipal regulations, property records, rationing systems, public health protocols that kept a European society functioning. They knew how to take ground and hold it. They had no idea how to make a water treatment plant work or organize food distribution for a city of 200,000. Patton knew this because he'd studied what happened after the last war. The Treaty of Versailles. The occupation of the Rhineland. The deliberate humiliation of Germany's military and political class. Patton had read extensively about it during the 1920s and 30s, and watched how the crushing terms of peace, the reparations, the war guilt clause, the systematic dismantling of German power, created the conditions that spawned Hitler. The logic seemed sound at the time. Defeat Germany so thoroughly that it could never threaten Europe again. Strip away its military, bankrupt its economy, humiliate its leaders. What actually happened? Economic collapse, political radicalization, and 20 years later a war that made the first one look restrained. Patton understood the pattern. Defeated people don't stay defeated when you grind their faces in it. They seethe. They organize. They find a demagogue who promises to restore their dignity through violence. Humiliation doesn't create peace. It creates the next war. So when Patton looked at Bavaria in May 1945, he saw a choice that would shape the next 50 years of European history. Option 1. Treat every German as a potential Nazi. Trust no one from the old system. Govern through force and suspicion. Arrest anyone who held rank in the Wehrmacht. Replace every German administrator with an American who didn't speak the language or understand the systems. Rule as conquerors. That approach would guarantee passive resistance, sabotage, and the slow collapse of whatever order remained. It would create exactly the resentment that had exploded into Hitler's rise. And practically speaking, it was impossible. He simply didn't have enough American personnel to govern 42 districts effectively. Option 2. Use the Germans who knew how these systems worked. The municipal administrators. The engineers. The logistics experts. Yes, many of them had been party members. You couldn't hold a government job in the Third Reich without joining the party. Yes, many of them had Wehrmacht ranks. But pragmatically, they were the only people who could prevent Bavaria from descending into complete chaos. Patton chose option 2, and it made him wildly controversial. The press called him soft on Nazis. Political officers from Washington questioned his loyalty. His own staff was divided. Many felt he was being naive, that you couldn't trust former German officers, that cooperation legitimized their service to Hitler. Eisenhower, his superior, was getting pressure from above. Use Germans as laborious, fine. Use them as translators, okay. But putting former Wehrmacht officers in positions of administrative authority? That looked like collaboration. That looked like Patton hadn't learned the lessons about German militarism that the war was supposed to have taught. But Patton had learned the lessons, just different ones. He'd learned that soldiers don't make good governors. He'd learned that destroying a nation's administrative class creates vacuum and chaos, not stability. He'd learned that if you need something from a defeated enemy, you have to give them a reason to cooperate that's more compelling than the satisfaction of watching you fail. Standing in front of von Skell, looking at this proud, defiant officer who'd rather die than cooperate, Patton was facing a microcosm of his entire strategic problem. He could force this. Have the man arrested. Make an example of him. Show every other German officer that defiance leads to punishment. Assert dominance. Demonstrate who holds power now. And what would that accomplish? Von Skell becomes a martyr to other German officers. The message spreads. The Americans want humiliation, not cooperation. Every Wehrmacht officer in Bavaria becomes more resistant, not less. The underground network of passive resistance grows. Food doesn't get distributed. Infrastructure doesn't get repaired. People die. And 20 years from now, someone writes the German version of Mein Kampf about how the Americans treated defeated soldiers with contempt. Or he could do what no one expected. Patton had two choices: force von Skell and create a martyr, or find a way to make him choose cooperation himself. The protocol for defiant German officers was well established by May 1945. Patton's staff officers knew it. Von Skell knew it. Everyone in that room knew exactly what was supposed to happen next. 3 weeks earlier, in the British occupation zone near Hamburg, a German Arborist, a colonel, had refused to cooperate with requisition orders. The British commander had him arrested on the spot, paraded through the town in handcuffs while German civilians watched, then imprisoned him for 6 months. The message was clear: cooperation isn't optional, and defiance will be publicly humiliated. In the French zone, General de Lattre de Tassigny took an even harder line. When a group of German officers balked at helping identify former SS members, de Lattre had them stand in the town square and publicly denounce the Wehrmacht, renounce their oaths, admit that Germany's cause had been criminal from a start. Some did it. Others refused and were threatened with war crimes prosecution, not because they'd committed war crimes, but because refusing to cooperate could be framed as obstruction of justice. The Soviet approach in the East was simpler and more brutal. Defiant German officers disappeared. Some ended up in the Gulag. Others were shot. The Soviets weren't interested in cooperation. They wanted submission through terror. It worked in the short term. German officers in the Soviet zone cooperated immediately and enthusiastically. It also guaranteed that every one of them was looking for the first opportunity to sabotage, flee, or undermine Soviet authority when the chance came. Even within the American zones, most commanders followed the standard playbook. Major General Ernest Harman, commanding the XXII Corps, told his officers explicitly, "These Germans need to understand they lost. Make that clear. Don't negotiate. Don't explain. Order and expect compliance. If they refuse, arrest them and find someone who will cooperate." The logic made sense on the surface. These were defeated enemies. They'd started the war. They'd committed atrocities. They'd fought to the bitter end even when the cause was obviously lost. Why show them consideration? Why treat their pride as something worth preserving? Make an example. Show them who's in charge. Demonstrate that resistance is futile and defiance is punished. Assert dominance until cooperation becomes the path of least resistance. And at the immediate tactical level, it worked. The arrested officers were replaced. The work got done. Orders were followed. But at the deeper strategic level, it failed catastrophically. Because here's what happens when you force a proud man to cooperate through humiliation. He cooperates with his mouth while his heart calculates revenge. He does exactly what you order, but no more. He tells you what you want to hear while concealing everything useful. He follows the letter of your commands while ensuring the spirit fails. In Hamburg, after the British arrested that defiant Arborist, cooperation rates among German officers technically increased. But so did accidents. Paperwork went missing. Translation errors occurred. Equipment broke down mysteriously. Food shipments were delayed due to unforeseen complications. Nothing you could prove was sabotage, but nothing worked quite right either. The French zone saw something similar. German officers who'd been forced to denounce the Wehrmacht in public squares became impeccably obedient and perfectly useless. They'd give you the address of a facility, but forget to mention the building had been destroyed. They'd identify personnel, but somehow the lists were always incomplete. They smiled and cooperated and ensured that the French administration remained perpetually one step behind the chaos. The psychology was simple. When you humiliate someone into compliance, you get compliance without investment. They'll do what you force them to do, but they'll never volunteer information, never take initiative, never actually care whether your administration succeeds or fails. Worse, you create a narrative that spreads through the entire defeated population. The Americans don't want cooperation, they want humiliation. Help them and you're a collaborator who betrayed Germany. Resist and you're a hero who maintained dignity in defeat. That narrative doesn't create open rebellion, The defeated enemy is too weak for that. It creates something more insidious, a culture of passive resistance where everyone goes through the motions while secretly hoping you fail. Von Skell expected exactly this treatment. He expected arrest, maybe public humiliation, possibly threats of war crimes prosecution despite having fought as a regular Wehrmacht officer with no connection to SS atrocities. He'd made his peace with it. That's why he stood ready to die, not because death was preferable to cooperation, but because death was preferable to forced submission that would strip him of dignity before destroying him anyway. Patton's staff expected it too. The young lieutenant's hand had drifted toward his sidearm the moment von Skell said, "You'll have to kill me." The other American officers were waiting for Patton to explode, or at minimum, to have von Skell removed and imprisoned as an example to others. That's what military protocol demanded. That's what every other occupation commander was doing. That's what 2,000 years of military tradition said was the correct response to insubordination from a defeated enemy. Make an example. Show them who's in charge. Break the will to resist. That's what von Skell expected. That's what Patton's staff expected. But Patton was playing a different game entirely. Patton walked to the window. Not quickly. Not with the explosive energy his staff had learned to read as the precursor to one of his legendary eruptions. He moved deliberately, boots echoing on the wooden floor of the commandeered town hall, each step measured. His right hand came to rest on the ivory grip of his revolver. The staff officers tensed. Von Skell's breathing remained steady, controlled, the breathing of a man who'd faced artillery barrages and accepted what was coming. But Patton didn't draw. His hand just rested there, fingers drumming once against the polished ivory, while he looked out at the street below. German civilians were clearing rubble from what had been a bakery. An old man with a Wehrmacht greatcoat, the insignia torn off, lifted broken bricks into a cart. Two women sorted through debris, salvaging what could be salvaged. A child, maybe 8 years old, thin as a rail, watched them work with the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen too much too young. The room behind Patton was absolutely silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall, one of the few things in the building that still worked properly. The American lieutenant's hand hovered near his sidearm. Another officer had started to reach for handcuffs on his belt, then froze when Patton moved to the window instead of issuing orders. Von Skell stood at rigid attention, waiting. His jaw was set. His dueling scar stood out pale against his weathered face. Whatever was about to happen, he was ready for it. 30 seconds passed. Then 45. In crisis situations, most leaders feel pressure to act immediately. To make a decision, issue an order, demonstrate command through visible action. The silence becomes uncomfortable. The waiting becomes unbearable. So they do something, anything, to fill the void and show they're in control. Patton had learned something different through 3 years of combat across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He'd learned that the most important moment in any confrontation isn't when you act. It's the moment before you act, when you're deciding which action serves your actual objective rather than just satisfying the emotional need to respond. The young officers behind him were thinking, defiance requires punishment. The protocol is clear. Make the decision. Execute it. Move on. But Patton was thinking deeper. Von Skell had said, "You'll have to kill me." Everyone heard it as defiance, as a challenge, as the statement of a man refusing to bend. But Patton heard something different. He heard a man who'd structured his entire identity around meaning, around the idea that his service, his oath, his 35 years in uniform meant something permanent and true. Von Skell wasn't refusing to cooperate because he was loyal to Hitler. The Third Reich was ashes. He wasn't refusing because he thought Germany could still win. That war was over. He was refusing because cooperation, in his framework, meant admitting that those 35 years had been empty. That the oath was just words. That a Prussian officer was just a man in a costume who switched sides when it became convenient. He'd rather die because death, at least, confirmed that the oath had power. That it meant something. That he was someone. Which meant von Skell didn't actually want to die. He wanted his life to have meant something. Death was just the only path he could see that preserved that meaning. The question Patton was asking himself, looking out at those German civilians clearing rubble, was this: can I give him a different path? One that preserves the meaning he's trying to protect, while getting him to do exactly what I need. Force wouldn't work. Von Skell had made his peace with death. Threatening him would only confirm his decision. Humiliating him would make him a martyr and spread exactly the narrative Patton couldn't afford, that Americans wanted submission, not cooperation. But if Patton could show Von Skell that his oath, his identity, his 35 years of service could mean something in cooperation rather than just in death. The clock ticked. 50 seconds. A full minute. Von Skell's hands, clasped behind his back, were white-knuckled. The American officers shifted weight from foot to foot. Outside, the old man in the Wehrmacht coat lifted another load of bricks, and the child watched with those hollow eyes. Patton's hand left his revolver and dropped to his side. He turned back to face Von Skell, and there was something in his expression that none of his staff officers had expected to see. Not anger. Not contempt. Something closer to recognition. The look of one professional reading another and understanding exactly what he was seeing. And then Patton said the words that would change everything. "General," Patton said, his voice carrying none of the explosive force his staff expected, "I accept your point." Von Skell's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his rigid composure. This wasn't the script. The conqueror was supposed to rage, threaten, punish. Not accept. A Prussian officer serves Germany, not conquerors, Patton continued, taking 2 steps closer. That's admirable. I respect that. In fact, I'm counting on it. The confusion on Von Skell's face was visible now. Behind Patton, the American officers exchanged glances. What was the general doing? Patton gestured toward the window, toward the civilians clearing rubble in the street below. "Tell me what you see out there, General." Von Skell hesitated, then glanced toward the window. German civilians. Rebuilding. Rebuilding with what? Patton's tone was conversational now, almost professorial. No functioning supply chains. No organized labor system. No coordination between districts. In 6 weeks, maybe less, those people are going to be starving. Disease will follow. Cholera, typhus. We are already seeing cases. You know what happens when public health systems collapse in a population this dense. Von Skell said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He did know. He'd seen it in the aftermath of the First World War, in the chaos of the early 20s. My men are soldiers, General. Good soldiers. They can take ground and hold it. But they're not administrators. They don't speak German. They don't know how your municipal systems work, how food distribution is organized, and which infrastructure needs to be prioritized to prevent cascading failures. We've got 6 American officers for every 100,000 German civilians in Bavaria. 6 men to govern 100,000 people whose cities are rubble. Patton moved to the map table, his finger tracing the red marks across Bavaria. 42 districts. 1.2 million displaced persons flooding in from the east. Every day my officers are trying to improvise solutions to problems they don't understand, in a language they don't speak, for a population that doesn't trust them. And every day they improvise poorly, more Germans suffer. He turned back to Von Skell. You've commanded logistics operations. You know this region. You know the systems, the people, the infrastructure. You know how to organize food distribution, coordinate repairs, and maintain public order. You know what needs to happen to keep those people out there alive. Von Skell's hands, still clasped behind his back, tightened. I know what you require of me, General Patton. And I have told you. You told me that a Prussian officer doesn't serve his conquerors. I heard you. Patton's voice hardened slightly, not with anger but with emphasis. And I'm not asking you to. The room went silent again. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. I'm not asking you to serve me, General. I'm asking you to serve Germany. Von Skell's breathing changed, just slightly, but Patton saw it. The first sign that the frame was shifting. Those people out there. Patton gestured toward the window again. They're your people. German civilians who need someone who knows what the hell he's doing to organize their survival. Right now, they've got American soldiers who mean well but are in over their heads. You can change that. He took another step closer, his eyes locked on Von Skell's. I have the authority to govern this district. You have the expertise to do it effectively. I'm offering you the power to protect German civilians during the worst crisis your nation has ever faced. My authority becomes your tool. Your knowledge becomes their protection. The reframe was almost complete, but Patton knew the crucial moment was still coming. Von Skell was listening now, but listening wasn't acceptance. The Prussian officer needed to understand what refusal actually meant. You can refuse if you want, General. I won't force you. I won't arrest you or humiliate you or make an example of you. Patton's voice dropped lower, more intense. But understand what you're choosing. He walked back to the window, and this time he waited until von Skell followed his gaze to the street below, to the old man in the Wehrmacht coat, to the women sorting rubble, to the hollow-eyed child. If you refuse, I'll find someone else. Someone less competent, less experienced, less capable. And while that person stumbles through problems you could solve, Germans will go hungry. Infrastructure will stay broken longer than it needs to. Disease will spread farther than it should. People will suffer more than necessary. Patton turned back to face him. So here's what I see, General. I see a man who spent 35 years serving Germany telling me he'd rather die than continue serving Germany. I see a man who swore an oath to protect German lives, choosing his pride over their survival. I see an officer who's confusing surrender with service. The words landed like artillery. Von Skell's face remained impassive, but something behind his eyes had shifted. The binary choice he'd constructed, cooperate with conquerors or die with honor, was being torn apart and reconstructed into something completely different. You want to know what serving conquerors looks like? Patton's tone softened slightly. It looks like doing what benefits them at your people's expense. It looks like collaboration for personal gain. It looks like betraying German interests to curry favor with occupying forces. He paused, letting that sink in. That's not what I'm offering you. I'm offering you a commission, a temporary military appointment to administer civilian affairs in a crisis situation. You'll have my full authority to organize food distribution, coordinate infrastructure repair, maintain public order, and protect civilians. You'll report to me on logistics and security, but the Germans are your responsibility. Your job isn't to serve American interests. Your job is to use American authority to serve German survival. Von Skell's scar seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. His mind was racing. Patton could see it in the minute changes of expression, the way his weight shifted almost imperceptibly. The oath you swore wasn't to a regime, General. You told yourself that through the Kaiser's abdication, through Weimar, through Hitler, the oath was to Germany eternal, to the German people, to the concept of the nation that transcends whatever political form it takes. Patton's voice carried absolute conviction now. Well, the German people are still here. They still need protection. They still need someone with competence and authority to organize their survival. The political form has changed, but Germany, the land, the people, the nation you swore to serve, hasn't gone anywhere. It's right out that window, clearing rubble and trying not to starve. He spread his hands. I'm giving you the chance to continue serving them. Not by taking orders from conquerors, but by accepting a wartime emergency commission to protect civilians during a crisis, using whatever authority is available, including mine, as a tool to accomplish that mission. The silence stretched. Von Skell's face was unreadable, but his hands had loosened slightly behind his back. So you have a choice to make, General. Not the choice you thought you had, between cooperation and death. The real choice, between serving Germany through this crisis, or abandoning Germany because the method of service doesn't fit your preferred narrative. Patton took one final step closer, near enough that he could speak quietly, almost intimately. You can die here today if you want. I won't stop you. But that death won't mean you kept your oath. It'll mean you broke it when it became inconvenient. Because the oath was to protect Germany, and right now, Germany needs you alive and working. He extended his hand, not aggressively, not as a demand, but as an offer. I need an administrator for this district. Someone competent, experienced, who gives a damn whether Germans survive the next 6 months. You're the best man for that job. Take it or leave it, but make your choice based on what actually serves Germany, not on what makes you feel noble. Von Skell stared at the extended hand, at Patton's face, at the window behind him where German civilians worked in the rubble. Patton hadn't backed down. The demand was still there: administer the district, use your expertise, cooperate with occupation forces. Nothing about the required actions had changed, but everything about the meaning of those actions had been transformed. Cooperation wasn't surrender. It was continued service. Using American authority wasn't a collaboration. It was taking whatever tools were available to protect German civilians. Accepting the commission wasn't breaking the oath. It was fulfilling the oath under new circumstances.
Wann shall es mein Recht?
Patton hadn't backed down. But everything had changed. Stop right there. Did you catch what just happened? Patton didn't change his demand. Von Skell is still going to administer the district, still going to cooperate with American forces, still going to do exactly what Patton needs. But by reframing cooperation as continued service to Germany instead of surrender to conquerors, Patton transformed resistance into genuine commitment. That's not manipulation. That's mastery. If you're watching this thinking, I need to remember this technique, you won't. Not without seeing how it plays out. So drop a comment right now telling me about a situation where you're facing someone trapped by their own pride. A resistant employee. A defiant teenager. A stubborn business partner. Because by the end of this story, you'll know exactly how to build them the bridge they need. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because this is the kind of leadership wisdom that doesn't get taught in business schools. It gets extracted from moments like this one, when one brilliant leader saw what everyone else missed. Now let's watch what happens when von Skell makes his choice.